My guest today is Elizma Lambert. Elizma is a talented and well-respected naturopathic practitioner, educator, and author with over 20 years of experience in functional medicine with special interests in functional diagnostics, nutrigenomics, and cellular dysfunction. She is internationally regarded as an expert in unraveling chronic illness. Her special interests are mitochondrial dysfunction, redox signaling, calcium signaling, neurotransmitters, dietary influences on our unique biochemistry, mold and biotoxin illness, and the gut microbiome. She is perhaps best known as a leading authority in functional test analysis, particularly in interpreting organic acids, which has earned her the nickname the Organic Acid Test Whisperer or the Oat Whisperer. In addition to her busy clinical practice, she is also a sought-after speaker, educator, and author, having co-authored books with other prominent international experts, including Leaky Gut, Leaky Cells, and Leaky Brain with Dr. Jess Armin, and The Dirty Genes, the Histamine Workbook with Dr. Ben Lynch and Angela Arthur. More exciting book projects on the horizon. I asked Elizma to join us today to share her expertise on the role of mast cell activation syndrome and histamine when it comes to a leaky gut and a leaky brain. Without further ado, I warmly welcome Elizma. Elizma, thank you so much for joining me for this chat. I am really looking forward to learning more about these areas of expertise that you have in mast cell activation syndrome and histamine and the relationship with the leaky gut and the leaky brain, because I think it's still kind of unknown. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's now a lot more talk about mast cell activation syndrome, but typically, we think sort of like about histamine in terms of allergies, sinus, hay fever. Now we also know that histamine is involved in things like eczema, but I don't think a lot of people think of histamine in the context of brain and neurological function that much, more really immune function. So, but more and more information sort of like is coming out. People are becoming a little bit more aware. But I think that's kind of like where we have to look at, that histamine is so much more than just allergies and things like that. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We put out some social media posts around the fact, did people know that histamine is in fact a neurotransmitter in and of itself? And I think it took a lot of people by surprise. But to set the scene, let's kind of go into a bit of a 101. What is mast cell activation syndrome and the role of histamine? Let's go and start
Yeah,
there.
so I guess if we start to look at, well, what is histamine? I mean, histamine can be classified as a hormone, can also be classified as a neurotransmitter, and of course, also in terms of the immune system, like a signaling molecule, and so forth. And it's quite interesting, like in terms of, if we look at hormones, normally hormones are released by an endocrine gland, right? Like the thyroid gland or the ovaries or what have you. When we look at histamine sort of like role as a hormone, it has a very localized response. So it's very much where is it released and then what's the receptors that it binds to and how it will sort of like function there. The same pretty much in terms of being a neurotransmitter as well. But when we look at its immune function, it's a much more diffuse kind of function that histamine has. In that kind of like context, from a, from an immune perspective, histamine is generally released by mast cells, but also basophils, and can also be released by other immune cells. For instance, in the brain, that can be released by microglial cells. And that's when it has more of an immune function. So that's when there is like an invader, pathogen, a toxin, or anything that the body deems should not be there, it would sort of like release histamine from a mast cell or a dendritic cell. Typically, your mast cells are kind of like, they sort of like sit around the border of mucous membrane. So that would be the lungs, the skin, the gut, and also in the brain. And they sort of like there to detect anything that shouldn't be there. They're like the first line of defense, so to speak. And if they see there's anything there that shouldn't be there, they will release histamine. Histamine is like their communication molecules. They also release more than just histamine, I should say. They also release a whole bunch of, other interleukins and signaling molecules.
Yep.
But that's the purpose of these cells, is to tell all the other immune cells, hey guys, there's something here. You guys need to
We're
come
under
here.
attack.
We're under attack. You need to come and help us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, but typically that is what, when we talk about mast cell activation syndrome, it means that for whatever reason for that person, their mast cells or their other histamine storage immune cells are releasing a lot of histamine or being activated, and they're on alert. The immune system is on alert. Now, sometimes it's justified, right? Well, I should say most of the time it's justified. And so there is something there that the body is reacting to that shouldn't be there. And that's an appropriate response, right? So if you think about histamine, specifically, like I guess when you have a mosquito bite or a bee sting,
Yep.
you get the redness, you get the swelling, you get the heat. And that's kind of like what histamine does. It creates the leakiness. That's how, fluid sort of like leaks out of the blood vessels and all of that. But that's kind of like what's supposed to happen. The whole point of the leakiness and the swelling is to get immune cells and fibroblasts and other cells into an area to either
Drawn
fight
there.
fight a pathogen or repair the area. All of those things have like a purpose. That's to get from one point to another point. The problem is when those cells are not switching off, if it's sort of like an ongoing immune response. And typically, I guess, if you want to then put a label on it, that's where we have the label mast cell activation syndrome, where there's this, uncontrolled kind of like mast cell response. Like I like to call them misbehaving mast cells, right? So they're not behaving as they're supposed to. They're kind of like going a little bit rogue, so to speak.
Bit
But
rogue.
that's
Yep,
the
love that.
immune aspect, right? That's the immune aspect of histamine. And then if we're talking about its role as a neurotransmitter, that's not histamine released from mast cells. That's histamine released from histamine neurons or histaminergic neurons.
Right.
And I think people sometimes we get confused the two with each other. They think that histamine has this one response in the body. I think that's where maybe a little bit more education is needed. It's like, well, no, the histamine that's released by histaminergic neurons have got a different function than histamine released by immune cells, like mast cells, which has a different function than histamine released by enterochromaffin-like cells in the gut, right? They all have different functions. And then it also depends on the receptors that histamine binds to. That will depend, what is it going to do? Is it going to amplify a response, or is it going to diminish a response? So there's a lot of these intricacies that I think we're learning a lot more about, or becoming more aware of, as we sort of like look through. But certainly, from a brain perspective, histamine is like an excitatory neuron, and it also has a role in regulating other neurotransmitters as well. So like GABA and glutamate and dopamine and serotonin and all of those neurotransmitters. So, I think we briefly spoke about it last time. It's when it comes to the brain neurochemistry, nothing's black and white. It's all an orchestra, and I think that's
sometimes
a challenge.
One of those instruments is out of tune and makes the harmony sound really off.
Absolutely, right. And if you sort of like change one of them, you're going to have a flow-on effect where it's going to change others around them as well, and which is what makes neurochemistry probably a lot more complex than what we would like it to be, but also very interesting as well if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. What you've touched on there is something is we often will pigeonhole something as, oh, well, histamine's bad because it causes all these problems, but we forget that, or we don't forget, maybe we aren't even aware that in biochemistry, there's never black, white, there's these shades of gray, and for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So histamine has as many positive qualities as it does negative, but for the purpose of today, I mean, we'll probably focus on the negative qualities because they do have a profound impact on the brain. So, like what makes it bad, and in terms of affecting our brain health and initiating things like brain fog, or, problems with thinking or problems with sleep?
Yeah, so histamine's role in the brain, it's got many different kind of like roles, but a major one is like it's the wakefulness neurotransmitter, right? It makes us awake and alert, which is a good thing during the day. That's you do want to be awake and alert.
Mm.
The problem comes, if there is too much histamine in the brain, let's say at nighttime, because
Yeah.
then that will kind of like interfere with sleep, right? You just lie awake and you or you wake up very early in the morning and can't fall back to sleep again.
Right. So
Um,
that could be histamine.
that could be histamine for
Yeah.
sure. And then also because it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, it can also trigger anxiety or irritability, overexcitation. I guess at the very extreme end, maybe seizure activity and things like that as well. I mean,
Yep.
there's lots of other excitatory neurotransmitters that can also be responsible. But certainly from a mast cell perspective in the brain, because there's mast cells in the brain as well, we see a lot of brain fog is a very, very common symptom. Vertigo, very common symptom as well. And I guess that kind of like comes into like, if you look at like, okay, well, what's histamine's functions? It does create leakiness. And when we talk about leakiness, we can say leaky brain, leaky gut, leaky blood vessels. In a way, that's kind of like one of the purposes of histamine is to allow things to cross from one side to the other side because there's a threat.
Yep.
And so it can sort of like cause leakiness, and then that in itself can have other repercussions. Things can get into the brain that shouldn't get into the brain, and so forth and so forth. But yeah, typical neurological symptoms, it is the anxiety, the wakefulness, and a lot of those symptoms that we sometimes also apply to CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome, that some people may be aware of. That's commonly associated with mold biotoxin issues, Lyme disease, and so forth. But we're also seeing it now a lot with I guess long COVID symptoms, right?
Right.
And what I would sort of like maybe call more like post-viral fatigue issues and things like that.
Yeah,
Because
because that wouldn't be just isolated to COVID. I'm guessing like chronic fatigue is something that viral infections have been initiating for years.
absolutely, Ross River fever, Epstein-Barr virus. It's interesting, like I remember, when a few years ago when COVID was quite big, there was all this talk about long COVID syndrome and all of that.
Mm.
And I was just thinking to myself, well, it's no different to other post-viral kind of like symptomatology. And recently, it may have been like a month ago or so, I think I read an article where I believe it's the Australian Medical Association, or at least some doctors were sort of like saying they don't actually want or like the use of the term long COVID, because they now just see it as post-viral
Illness.
symptomatology, the same as all other viruses. And the reason for that is because again, these are viruses, infections, they trigger an immune response, right? So anything that triggers an immune response will involve histamine, whether it's bacterial, parasitic, viral, or any of those kinds of
Exposures,
yeah,
pollens, food allergens.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
So what is it then that goes from this appropriate immune response that we want from histamine? Like where do things go wrong that it doesn't get shut off, or that it's constantly being triggered? What do you find are the common reasons there?
So there can be a few different reasons. So it could just be that the body doesn't get the message that the threat is over, and it can now calm down. So sometimes it just, I guess, gets stuck in that
Yep.
inflammatory response. Um, a lot of times it's to do with the mast cells being unstable themselves. So you have to kind of like imagine mast cells are a little bit like, imagine they're like balloons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And inside these balloons, you have all of this histamine and other kind of like cytokines. And so sometimes the balloon, I guess, is quite robust. And so, when you play with it outside and it bounces on the grass, it's fine. It doesn't pop. And then other times it's super, super sensitive, and anything just, the slightest touch
That's
just
it.
makes it explode.
Mm.
So in that aspect, we're talking about, I guess, membrane stability, but also, I guess, how healthy the membranes are. And so for some people, the mast cell membranes are, I guess, quite thin, or not very healthy, or very reactive. And there's various reasons why that can happen as well. I mean, I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but hormones could play a role there, right? So progesterone for females, progesterone is a mast cell stabilizer. Estrogen makes mast cells more trigger happy, which could probably be a reason why for women who have mast cell issues and they're still in their reproductive years, they may find that, during their cycle, their allergies get worse or their histamine symptoms get worse, right?
Right.
I mean, that's one example. Stress is another really common trigger for mast cell activation syndrome or cortisol. Toxins are a big one, and certainly with foods, if there's sort of like if the body thinks that if food is foreign, then we can start getting the food kind of like sensitivities. I mean, that in itself is a really interesting aspect of, well, why do the mast cells in the gut, if you eat like a food like, I don't know, I'm just going to, let's say gluten, why does the body think, oh, this is foreign, I should react to it, right? And that can involve a whole bunch of other biochemical compounds, which can get quite complex, but there are often reasons why histamine or mast cells don't shut off. And sometimes it could also be, often it has to do with the receptors, how well the histamine receptors work. So, for example, there's 4 histamine receptors, and histamine, the H3 histamine receptor is what we call actually an autoreceptor. So if histamine binds to that receptor, it actually signals for histamine cells to produce less histamine. So that's the way of controlling how much histamine gets released, or to always kind of like keep it in balance. So if those autoreceptors aren't working very well, then the cells don't get the signal to release or produce less histamine. So that would be one aspect. Generally, if it binds to H1, H2, or H4 histamine receptors, depending on where these receptors are, that will tend to amplify the response. So sometimes it's the receptors that don't work well. There could be genetic components as well. There are some genes that are very specific. But I'd probably say the most common reason would be that the body is not breaking down histamine sufficiently. That's probably one of the biggest reasons. If we just move a little bit away from mast cell activation syndrome as a condition, but we just look at why do people have histamine symptoms. In my opinion, the most common reason is that histamine is not being broken down adequately or not quickly enough. And so that just means at any one point in time, there's more histamine floating around than there should be.
So how or what is needed to help the body along with histamine breakdown? I'm assuming that's enzymes.
Yeah. So if you look at sort of like histamine breakdown, there's 3 pathways that histamine can be broken down. The very small pathway is the NAT2 pathway, which is a very minor pathway. It really is just a little backup pathway in case the other 2 pathways don't work well. So we don't really look at that pathway too much. Then there's the one of the big pathways is what we call the DAO pathway, and that's essentially gut histamine, right? So there's histamine is a component of a lot of foods, typically aged foods. So aged foods, that'll be like leftovers, foods that have been cooked for a long time, fermented foods, cheese, so overripe fruits. So rule of thumb, aged foods would be typically
they accumulate histamine in the life cycle of the food. Yeah,
that's right. So they become higher and higher histamine the older, the more it ages, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also certain bacteria that produce histamine as well. And certainly if certain bacteria become pathogenic, then that can also trigger more mast cell activation. And so in the gut, you need DAO enzymes to break down histamine. And those DAO enzymes, they sit sort of like in the cells in the small intestine. And some of the DAO enzymes are sitting on the outside surface of the enterocytes or the small intestinal cells. And some of the DAO enzymes are inside the enterocytes. But they sort of like control gut histamine. Now, if there's anything going on in the gut like SIBO, or which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or there's damage to the intestinal lining, which then would mean that there's not that much DAO enzymes there to do their job, then you can end up with too much gut histamine, right? And then that in itself, because histamine creates leakiness, will then create leaky gut or contribute to the creation of leaky gut.
Creating a cycle.
That's right. And now that that histamine crosses into the bloodstream. Now,
Mm.
when histamine crosses into the bloodstream, then we sort of like get more into the HNMT histamine route, which is governed by methylation. And we won't get too much into methylation
Massive
because that's a
topic.
whole nother topic. But so where DAO is more in the gut, in the blood, in the system, or in the bloodstream, it's more really regulated by HNMT, which is a different route. Now, it's not 100% true. I mean, DAO is also found in the uterus and all of that, but just for simplicity purposes, DAO is gut, and in the system, it's HNMT.
Mhm.
And so now you need a whole bunch of different nutrients and enzymes to kind of like break down histamine once it's in the system. And so that's why for some people, they can have the systematic histamine symptoms like the eczema and the allergies and the hay fever and the runny eyes and all of those kinds of things. But they don't really have, let's say, many gut histamine symptoms, or vice versa. But typically, if we look at sort of like how it progresses, it pretty much always starts from the gut. Like the gut histamine issues start first, and then later on you get the eczema or the asthma or the whatever systemic kind of like issues that you end up with.
Yeah.
But you do kind of like, I want to say you treat them slightly differently. You have to kind of like understand that they're connected somehow, but you may use different nutrients for gut histamine than you would use for, let's say, systemic histamine. And certainly in the brain, the only way that we can break down histamine in a healthy way in the brain is through that HNMT route.
Right.
Um,
So
there
supporting
are
methylation is really important in that regard.
absolutely, and then and it kind of like makes sense if you think about, B12 and the B vitamins being so important for brain health and all of
Mm.
that. I mean, there is backup systems. I mean, the body always has backup systems, but
Mm.
it's always at the expense of something else. If there really, really is like a lack of methylation in the brain, it can sort of like be broken down directly by MAOA, MAOB enzymes in the brain, but
Mhm.
that's not ideal. It sort of like forms these other byproducts that's not that great, in the
Yeah.
brain kind of thing. So, but yeah, the body will always find ways to do things, I guess, if there's really something lacking there.
So it kind of makes sense, I guess, that we're seeing these surges in these histamine issues when we consider how many people have really poor gut health, or are eating, living, or even being prescribed things that have an impact upon gut health and a worsening of it over time. And then on top of that, not only do you have poor gut health, so you're poorly absorbing a lot of your nutrients, which will include a lot of those important methylation nutrients. It's kind of almost like this cycle of being undernourished and lacking the resources to just deal with what's being thrown at you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I'm glad that you sort of like mentioned that. It's like, yeah, it may start in the gut, but as we know, that's where nutrient absorption takes place, right?
Mm.
And if we're now not digesting our food properly, not absorbing nutrients properly, then we start getting deficiencies in nutrients for these other histamine pathways, but not just histamine. We now also have issues with other neurotransmitters, right?
Mm.
Even if you go back to histamine's function in the gut, one of its main functions is for gastrin release, right? Stomach acid production and stomach acid release through the enterochromaffin-like cells in the stomach. So whilst we're talking about too much histamine and its symptoms, if there's not enough histamine released, let's say in the gut by these specialized stomach cells, then we're not going to get the stomach acid release. We're not going to digest our proteins very well. We know that we need proteins to be digested for amino acids, which are the substrates for all our neurotransmitters,
Yeah,
right?
building
Serotonin,
blocks.
dopamine, everything, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the interesting things that I often see when we do testing is people who've had long-term mast cell activation. They've had all these allergies in this immune kind of like release of histamine, so they end up with the brain fog and all of the eczema and all of those kinds of things. Because you need the amino acid L-histidine to make histamine,
Mhm.
I've often seen people kind of like end up with very low levels of L-histidine because their mast cells are just pumping out all of this histamine, right?
Right.
And so eventually you run out of the ingredients to bake the cake, so to speak. And
Yeah.
so that can then often have a detrimental effect on the neurotransmitter, the functional histamine. So now there's less histamine for digestion. There's less histamine in the brain for neurological function.
Yeah.
And so in a weird way, some people can end up with both high and low histamine symptoms, right?
Right. It's pretty
They end
tricky.
up, yeah, they end up with a high immune histamine symptoms with the inflammation, but they can end up with a lower neurological and gut histamine, which is like needed for digestion. So, which is why it's sometimes quite tricky. Because we tend to think of things as just, well, either we have high levels of this or low levels of that. And it's like, well, no, it actually can sometimes not always work like that, which
Yes, our organ systems don't work independently. They're also an
that's right.
orchestra of instruments that need to create the harmony, right? And so you mentioned just before, when you do testing to unravel this, I would imagine just because of, well, obviously you would have people sitting across from you describing all the things they're going, you're formulating a picture in your mind of, what kinds of things they're experiencing, and then you're going to verify it with testing. So what and how do you decide what to test, and what does it tell you?
So if you want to sort of like test more for, let's say, more towards mast cell activation syndrome, or if there's mast cell issues, like very common tests we will do is and this is just blood tests, so serum tests that can be done by, your general practitioner, is we look at things like TGF-beta1, which can be a really good marker. Tryptase is another good marker. C4a is another really good marker. So they can sort of like tell us whether there's excessive immune activation, because typically if there's a high histamine, these markers will be high. Some of those markers will be high because they're released in an attempt to sort of like reduce histamine. And so if you sort of like see those markers high, then you know that, yeah, this person probably has some kind of like mast cell activation going on. I mean,
Okay.
IgE, another common one.
Yep.
I can also indicate histamine. Now, you can measure, we talked a little bit about the DAO enzyme. You can measure serum DAO levels and also serum histamine. Now, in my experience, I have not found serum histamine to be very useful. There may be other people out there who disagree with me, but I see a lot of normal serum histamine levels in people with very clear histamine symptoms.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I don't find that a very reliable marker is because serum histamine, it doesn't have a very long half-life in the blood. I believe it could be 60 seconds or 80 seconds or something like that.
Right. So it's
So
really just a small snapshot in time, isn't it?
it is. It's a really small snapshot in time. So if you did want to sort of like measure histamine, the urinary N-methylhistamine is probably more accurate if you want to do that. But at the end of the day, Beck, I would also say I'm a big believer in signs and symptoms. Sometimes, it's very obvious that someone's got histamine issues, and it's not always, even if tests sometimes come back normal.
Normal.
I wouldn't disregard that there is a histamine thing going on there, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes, you've got to sort of like go by the signs and the symptoms as well. But those are very common markers that one can sort of like test for. They're more the direct markers.
Yep.
Then you can obviously get what I call indirect markers.
Yep.
So for instance, if someone has SIBO, which is a breath test,
Yep.
it's very likely they're going to have some kind of histamine symptoms. They'll have other issues as well because their whole digestion mechanism would be affected, right? So histamine is not going to be the only thing, but I'd be surprised if someone didn't have some kind of like histamine issue who had SIBO.
Yep.
And so when you're talking about indirect markers, you're now really more measuring for things that could be causing the histamine issue, or the mast cell issue or what have you. So that's more like testing for infections, testing for toxins, checking hormone levels, estrogen and cortisol and progesterone and all of those things, and seeing if there's anything there that could be making mast cells more trigger happy, and that sort of like produce symptoms. A very easy test to do is that I sometimes get my clients to do, and I don't suggest this as a treatment. So I don't want people to go out there and say, oh, well, I'll just take an antihistamine and that solves all my problems. But it sometimes can be a good sort of like little test if you want to see, well, is this a rabbit hole I should go down? And so what I sometimes get people to do, especially if they've got brain histamine symptoms like the brain fog, irritability, anxiety, sleeping issues, is I'll get them to take something like an over-the-counter first-generation antihistamine, so Benadryl or something like that. And then I'll get them to just take it for a couple of nights, right? 2 nights, 3 nights, and just see what happens. And if histamine is a really, really, really big issue of your neurological symptoms, generally what will happen is within that short space of time, you'd find there's some improvement in your brain symptoms. And that just kind of gives us an idea of like, okay, is histamine involved in your brain symptoms? And if so, how much is it playing a role in terms of sort of like brain histamine symptoms and things like that? So that can sometimes be like a quick little experiment to just see if that's an area to kind of like look at.
Some of those medications, though, if they're confirming or they have an improvement on symptoms, I guess the side note on that is though if you go down the path of going, oh well, that's fixed my symptoms, it can also worsen them over time, right?
Absolutely, because it's like, because all you're doing, you're just stopping histamine from binding to the receptor. You're not reducing the histamine. The histamine is still floating around.
Yeah, it's kind of a band-aid over a bullet hole, kind of.
That's right. And you run the risk of also of desensitizing the receptors. I mean, it happens with everything, whether we're talking dopamine receptors or insulin receptors. If there's a whole bunch of things floating around and you're sort of like blocking those receptors, you can end up just making those receptors more desensitized over time. So
can we improve that? Like I know with, say, insulin receptors, in the case of insulin resistance, like it can be really hard to wind that back. So is that something that's treatable, that you can make improvements on the receptors, or kind of once you've worn them out, that's it, they're kind of a little bit cooked?
I like to think that there's always something we can do, right? And certainly with I mean, think about if we, get a little bit off histamine, if you think about addictions, right? So whether we talk about nicotine addiction or alcohol addiction or what have you, that's all to do with the receptor desensitization. So can you get over addictions? Sure you can. Is it easy? No, it's not, right? It's some things are easier than others. So certainly you can retrain those receptors. Now, how long that'll take, I think, is going to be very individual from one person to the other. There may be genetic components there. People who have very, I guess, what I would call slow receptors will maybe find it a little bit harder than people with oversensitive receptors. But yeah, you could certainly retrain the body and get it to become sensitized again. But anyone who's ever tried to give up very strong addictions, trying to give up benzodiazepines, know that sometimes it's a very difficult road to go down.
Usually challenging, but does tend to respond well to many of the same kind of nutrients and herbs that support brain chemistry, but are also really strongly antioxidant and antihistamine in nature. So an interesting parallel there.
Absolutely.
So one of the things I wanted to get into is this concept of the leaky brain barrier. And I think when we talked offline, we were talking a little bit about the relationship with histamine and glutamate and sort of how that unravels things. So do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So with again, when we look sort of like in the brain, one of the cells that's kind of like responsible for the brain barrier is the astrocytes. And so astrocytes are kind of like they're a type of brain cell that's often called the housekeepers of the brain. So they kind of like do cleanup duty kind of thing. But they also are involved in maintaining a really healthy blood-brain barrier. I'm trying to remember what the mechanism of it is, but I believe astrocytes releases a compound. It's a compound that's similar to brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but it's not, but it's something similar. And that's kind of like helps to repair and keeps the blood-brain barrier really healthy, right?
Okay.
But one of the things that astrocytes can also do, they don't produce histamine, but they do respond to histamine. So if
Okay.
there's a lot of histamine being released by either mast cells in the brain or microglial cells in the brain, which is kind of like the immune cells of the brain,
Yep.
then that histamine can go and bind to H1 histamine receptors on astrocytes. And if it binds to those astrocytes, and astrocytes will release glutamate. And glutamate, whilst I believe it's the major neurotransmitter in the brain, and we need it for memory and learning and again, cell signaling and all kinds of things. If there's too much glutamate being produced, then that in itself can become an excitotoxin. It can also start to damage neurological structures, over excitation of the brain.
Yep.
And so often you can get sort of like this double whammy with high histamine, is you get, with a high histamine comes the high glutamate.
Right.
And there's a lot of overlap between high glutamate and high histamine symptoms, It's the wakefulness, not being able to sleep, the anxiety, irritability, brain fog, and all of those kinds of things. And if we then sort of like relate it back to the gut, it's also why a lot of people, they start getting these food intolerances and they're not sure what it is they're intolerant to. They're reacting to histamine foods, but then it also seems they're reacting to glutamate foods. But often it's because there's some kind of a link between them, where one thing causes another thing, and then before you know it, you have all these food reactions and you don't know exactly what it is you're reacting to. It's a bit of a mixed bag. But that's kind of like, that plays a fairly big role in the brain. It's that balance between the histamine balance does play a really, really important role also with other neurotransmitters. And I guess whilst we're on that, if we look at sort of, because there's also, we talk about histamine receptors on histamine brain cells, we talk about histamine receptors on, mast cells and things like that. But there's also histamine receptors on what we call non-histamine cells. So because there's a lot of different brain cells, right? Some of the neurons will release histamine, some neurons will release GABA, some neurons will release dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually histamine receptors on these dopaminergic neurons and GABAergic neurons and serotonergic neurons, right? And
So it could
so,
block them.
well, that's what can happen, right? So if there's a
Mm.
lot of histamine in the brain and it binds to these to a lot of the receptors on these other neurons, it will decrease the release of GABA, decrease the release of serotonin, decrease the release of dopamine. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it. It probably doesn't work exactly like that.
Yeah.
There'd be so many other nuances there too. But the point I'm trying to make is that histamine can actually cause dysregulation of other neurotransmitters as well. So you may
Yep.
start off with a high histamine symptomatology,
Yep.
but then eventually end up with low GABA symptomatology, low serotonin symptomatology, which is kind of like the low mood. And it just kind of like amplifies the anxiety aspect and the not being able to sleep aspect.
That could certainly explain why you can get such swings and variance with both natural and pharmaceutical things that are designed to influence dopamine and serotonin. But if you've got this aberrant kind of histamine glutamate problem, like that kind of makes sense that people can get weird or not a no
Absolutely.
outcome. It would be the least problematic, but sometimes people get these crazy swings and
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges, that we do face when we're looking at mental health, and we try and treat mental health symptoms with whether it's natural or pharmaceutical. I don't think it really matters,
mm,
because a lot of the times, and it's no one's to blame. It is unfortunate that it's such a complex system, but
mm,
often when we try and compartmentalize someone and say, oh, okay, you've got low serotonin, let's boost your serotonin. And sometimes that's the right approach, but sometimes it can backfire, because by raising the serotonin, you've now kind of like trickled off a domino effect somewhere else that you may not have been aware of. And now you're creating issues somewhere else, which
mhm.
is often, and it's kind of like frustrating to see, but sometimes you have people who are on like 5 different types of um, you know, I don't want to say antipsychotics, but 5 different medications working on different brain neurotransmitters. And
Yep.
if you work it back, you can see, well, yeah, this one is to deal with the side effects of this one, which is to deal with the side effects of this one, because we're not really looking at them all together as a whole.
Mm, very true.
Yeah, which, I'd say the way we're moving with AI and all of that kind of stuff, one day I'm sure we'll just be able to put symptoms in, press a button, and we'll have the perfect answer, and we don't have to work it out ourselves, which is just
Yeah.
very difficult to do. But
So we don't
we
end up with people who have to be wound back from polypharmacy, where they're taking all these different kinds of medications. It's at often very huge cost as well, both financially, but also with their well-being. Yeah, the AI may help to simplify it. I've been watching that closely. I think that's super interesting, and what a great side benefit of AI. The
yes,
accuracy is mind-blowing, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, it still has its challenges at the moment, but I don't know. In our lifetime, we've seen so many changes in technology. It's just incredible how fast things are changing, and so who knows where we will be in 5 years' time.
It's so true. Back when we were studying, students of today will have no idea, but like there was not really the internet in the way we have it now, and there was no TikTok and there
No.
was no social media. So your access to information was like the library, or if you were lucky enough to own your own set of encyclopedias, like way to
That's
make
right.
yourself old. But
But that's
I
what
was
I
thinking,
remember being at uni, and like, yeah, we still had to spend the afternoons in the library going through encyclopedias,
I
right?
can remember sitting on the library floor with boxes of the different, like now you can just look it up on PubMed, but you actually had to flick through the physical
Yes.
pages of all the studies of all the issues. You forget now when you reference them, it's like issue 5 of, autumn edition of this journal, but you actually used to have to physically look them up.
That's right. Yeah, we're probably giving our age away here, but yeah,
Yeah,
but it's just amazing how things have changed, and so it will definitely be different in 5 years' time.
absolutely.
Um,
So, sort of a final roundabout, and I know that you're going to laugh at me because there's so many hallways to run down with this one, but generally speaking, if someone is having a histamine problem or mast cell activation, it sounds first and foremost like absolutely we have to work on the gut, which no shock there. The old naturopathic
yep,
Hippocrates, all diseases begin in the gut, and I think if science is proving anything, is that he was completely right. But like gut plays a massive role. But what are the things that we regularly reach for in natural medicine to help support people through this?
well, typical things, if you just sort of like want to work on the histamine itself, um, very common things would be mast cell stabilizing nutrients. So that could be bioflavonoids, vitamin C,
Hmm.
antioxidants, vitamin E. They all can be very useful in sort of like stabilizing mast cells and
Hmm.
making them less trigger happy.
Yep.
Um, Other aspects would be to make mast cell membranes healthy, and that'll be like your omega-3s and your omega-6s and your phosphatidylcholine, all those fats and things
Yep.
to sort of like make them healthy.
Yep.
But then also in terms of like, gut histamine, DAO enzymes can sometimes be very useful
Hmm.
to try and kind of like reduce some of that gut histamine. And on that line with gut histamine, because I kind of like refer to gut histamine creating leaky gut. And so sometimes it's also about, whilst you're working on what's creating the histamine issue, whether it be SIBO or what have you, can sometimes be very useful to reduce the histamine in the meantime, to just stop that leakiness,
Hmm.
kind of thing, to give the
As
gut
in
a
the
chance to heal.
foods? You mean foods and triggers?
Well, it can be foods, but it can be reducing like high histamine foods, taking DAO enzymes,
Yep.
anything that can sort of like just take pressure off, I guess, histamine in the gut, and then that can allow the gut to heal. Because sometimes, if there's a lot of histamine stuff going on, and you're giving someone, all of these gut nutrients and glutamine and all of this kind of like stuff, uh, sometimes it doesn't work because it's like throwing water in a bucket with a hole in it, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And so
Yep.
sometimes it can be very beneficial to reduce the histamine in the gut, just to give you a bit of chance to sort of like deal with the real issues. And that could be, like I said, reducing histamine foods and taking DAO enzymes.
Mm.
What I will say in terms of reducing histamine foods, a lot of healthy foods have got histamine in them. And so anytime when we're sort of like looking at, I guess, um, elimination diets or restricting foods, we do generally like to think of that as a temporary thing, just to sort of like buy us time to fix things. But then
Yep.
there are also foods that probably we shouldn't be having anyway, like alcohol, which is very, very high histamine, right? So I guess in that respect, you're probably trying to definitely avoid the high histamine foods that doesn't really have any health benefits.
Mhm.
Um, but then the aim would be to sort of like get foods back in that may be high histamine, but do have health benefits kind of like over time.
It raises a really important point because we said it earlier about that cascade of you've got a gut problem, which is decreasing your absorption, and which is then having a flow-on effect in your nutrient status and blah blah blah. So if we go on really restrictive diets, sometimes whilst that is it's just like a great short-term fix to stop or take the pressure off is the great way you've explained that. But otherwise, if it's prolonged, it adds to the problem because it adds to nutrient deficiency if we're not eating a nutrient dense diet and we're not absorbing, because we're not just what we eat but what we absorb.
Absolutely, yeah, because it is you start getting B vitamin deficiencies and mineral deficiencies and all kinds of stuff, and and that's kind of like what a lot of us are seeing in practice. You know, initially eliminating whatever food is that's triggering your symptoms, it makes you feel good, but the
Mm,
longer that goes on, you sort of like start ending up with deficiencies and not feeling so good, right? So
mm.
yeah, and that's, it can sometimes be a little bit challenging, especially for people who are very sensitive, and they're even sensitive to supplements and things like that. Which is why, these days we don't really see the easy kind of like cases anymore. Like I think things have definitely become a lot more complex than what it was 10 years ago in terms
Mm.
of, where people are with their health, unfortunately.
And also, yeah, I mean, just in gut health alone, I often am thinking about years ago when I was studying naturopathy, IBS was a fairly new term, but we'd never even heard of SIBO. We'd never
No,
heard of
no,
mast cell activation syndrome.
no.
Histamine was still just an allergy chemical.
That's right. And all you had to do was give them zinc, B6, and magnesium, and they'll be fine,
Yeah,
It's like, well, no,
these
it
days, not so
doesn't work
much.
like that anymore.
Yeah, I know. And also obviously, not to get too doom and gloom, but just the level of things we're exposed to on a daily basis, from personal care products to our water supply to our food security. Like it's a lot of things and toxins and chemicals that we come into contact with every day that our detoxification systems and our gut have to deal with. So it's any wonder that most of us find ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah,
What's the
no, I
statistic
wanted
now? It's like I think it's like 1 in 3 or 1 in 6 people has a chronic illness.
that. Yeah, wow. I mean, I remember, not that this is really about autism, but I remember, I mean, the statistics was at one point 1 in a million, and then it became, I don't know, like 20 years ago, I think it was already 1 in 60. I don't even know what it is now, but it's just
Mm,
like we're just seeing things that we never saw before. And I mean, there's plenty of theories on a lot of these things, but I think one of the major things was probably the Industrial Revolution, in that our genetics have always been able to adjust, or sort of like keep up with changes in our environment. And a lot of genetic polymorphisms are actually occurred, you know, over for evolutionary reasons, as kind of like a protective mechanism.
mm.
But because we've been exposed to so much, chemicals and toxins in a very short space in time, like with 100 years, 150 years,
Yeah,
uh, our bodies just haven't had
that
time to kind of like
adaptation.
catch up, right? So
Yeah.
it's like our bodies are just reacting to the environment kind of like around us.
See, and
Um,
now that is a discussion we can have on another day, is genes and
mm,
polymorphisms and the neurobiochemistry around those, because that's actually multiple topics, really. Let's throw like 4 or 5 chats. But,
yeah.
I know that's something you have an extraordinary amount of expertise in. So that's definitely something we'll have to chat about in the future. But for anyone who's listening, obviously you deal with a lot of chronic illness, like it's your strength, it's your special skill, your zone of genius. You unravel people's very complicated health issues. So, where can people find you online and elsewhere so that if they want to access your advice, they can?
Well, they can go to my website, which is elizmalambert.com. They can also contact us at office@elizmalambert.com. And that's pretty much where they can find me. I'm not big on social media yet. Maybe one day I'll see. But certainly they can access me there and get in contact, and we can certainly see if we can help them.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this chat. We did manage to keep it to under an hour, which is unusual
Amazing.
for us. So, but yeah, I can't thank you again enough, and I look forward to speaking with you again on more stuff.
Me too, Beck. No, this is great. Thank you for inviting me.